A new police chief decided to go undercover to see her officers in action. But when a white cop slapped her in public, thinking she was just another nobody, he had no idea his career was seconds away from crumbling. The morning sun poured through the tall oak trees, casting long golden streaks across the park's walking trails. Joggers moved rhythmically to the beat of their music. Mothers pushed strollers, and elderly couples strolled hand in hand, soaking in the crisp air of a new day. The park was alive yet peaceful, a place where no one expected trouble. At the far end of a quiet pathway, a woman walked alone. Dressed in sleek athletic gear, she moved with quiet confidence, her pace unhurried, her posture upright. Her deep brown skin gleamed under the sunlight, and her expression was unreadable. Calm, but with a certain presence that made those who truly observed her pause for a second glance. But today, no one was truly looking. She stopped by a wooden bench near a small pond, pulling out her phone. A call. A voice on the other end greeted her formally, their words clipped and professional. She listened, nodding slightly, but her gaze remained on the water in front of her. The voice continued, speaking of deadlines, upcoming reports, and personnel shifts. Nothing she wasn't used to. From across the park, a police cruiser rolled to a slow stop. Officer Daniels stepped out, adjusting his belt as his eyes scanned the area. Mid-40s, solid build, and an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. He had been on the force long enough to believe he knew everything about everyone. His gaze locked onto the woman on the bench. Something about her made his jaw tighten. A black woman, sitting alone, phone in hand, suspicious. Daniels took a step forward, then another. Near the patrol car, a younger officer hesitated. Officer Reed had been with the force for only 2 years, and he had seen Daniels act on his impulses before. More than once, he had watched things escalate over nothing. His fingers twitched at his side as he recognized the woman from a briefing just days ago. His stomach tightened. "Sir," Reed started, but Daniels barely acknowledged him. "Stay here," Daniels muttered. "I got this." Reed swallowed hard, but obeyed, his gaze darting between Daniels and the woman on the bench. Daniels approached with long, deliberate strides. The woman remained seated, unfazed, still listening to her call. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves. Daniels cleared his throat loudly. She didn't flinch. "Ma'am," he said sharply. She turned, her eyes meeting his, steady, unreadable. "I need to see some ID," Daniels continued, his voice carrying the weight of assumption, of expectation. The woman tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. "Excuse me?" "You've been sitting here for a while. We got reports of suspicious activity in the area," he said. A lie, but one he delivered without hesitation. She exhaled slowly, glancing around the park. People walked by, unaware of the brewing tension. "Suspicious activity," she echoed, more a statement than a question. Daniels nodded, his hand resting casually on his belt, just above his holster. "You fit the description." A moment passed. The woman didn't move, didn't reach for anything. Instead, she watched him. Her gaze wasn't defensive, nor fearful. It was something else entirely, something Daniels couldn't place. In the distance, Officer Reed shifted uncomfortably, fingers curling into fists. He wanted to say something, anything. But what could he do? Then, for the briefest moment, Reed saw something others had overlooked. A small silver badge chain, barely visible beneath the woman's jacket. His breath caught. But before he could open his mouth, Daniels took a step closer. A single drop of tension hit the air. And just like that, everything was about to spiral out of control. Daniels took another step forward, his presence looming over the seated woman. His fingers twitched near his belt, just enough to suggest authority, to remind her who was in control. I said, "I need to see some ID." His voice was sharper this time, a demand rather than a request. The woman didn't move. She simply looked at him, head slightly tilted, her expression unreadable. There was no fear in her eyes, no nervous hesitation, just an unsettling calmness, as if she had seen this exact moment play out before. "That's interesting," she said softly, her voice measured, "because I don't recall doing anything that requires me to show identification." Daniel's jaw tightened. He had dealt with enough defiant people to know where this was going. She was going to push back, make a scene, maybe even pull the race card. He wasn't in the mood. "Ma'am, this isn't a debate. Either you cooperate, or I'll have to assume you're resisting an investigation." That word, resisting. A trap, wrapped in legal authority. A few people passing by slowed their steps, sensing the tension. A man jogging nearby glanced over but quickly looked away. A mother with her child took a different path. No one interfered. Still seated, the woman sighed, shifting her weight slightly. An investigation? For what exactly? Daniels took a step closer, now towering over her. "You're in a public space, lingering, making phone calls. Someone reported suspicious activity. Now, last time I checked, cooperating with law enforcement wasn't optional." Her lips pressed together briefly, as if holding back something she wanted to say. Then, she exhaled. "And what exactly did this report say I was doing?" Daniels scoffed. "Lady, I don't have to explain myself to you." She finally moved, slowly, deliberately, putting her phone in her pocket and placing both hands on her knees. It was a small shift, but somehow it changed everything. It was the kind of movement that made Daniel's instincts flare up, his body tensing like a coiled spring. Behind him, Officer Reed took half a step forward. His hands were clammy, heart pounding in his chest. He had seen Daniels escalate situations before, but this was different. He wanted to intervene, to say something, but fear held him back. Daniels, oblivious to Reed's hesitation, squared his shoulders. "I won't ask again. Stand up and show me your ID, or I'll assume you have something to hide." The woman's gaze flickered past him for a split second. Just a brief glance at Officer Reed, so quick that if you weren't paying attention, you'd miss it. Then, she looked back at Daniels and finally rose to her feet. Even though she was shorter than him, her presence seemed to grow the moment she stood. Daniels didn't like it. "There," she said, brushing off invisible dust from her sleeve. "I'm standing. Now what?" Daniels took it as defiance, a challenge. His temper flared. "Turn around," he ordered. "Hands where I can see them." A flicker of something crossed her face. Disbelief, perhaps, but she didn't move. "For what reason?" she asked, voice still calm, still unshaken. Daniels clenched his jaw. Enough of this. Before Officer Reed could stop him, Daniels grabbed her wrist, and in that moment, time seemed to slow. A gasp rippled through the few onlookers who had stopped to watch. The woman tensed for the briefest second, but she didn't fight back. She didn't even try to pull away. She just stared at him, and something changed in her expression. It was no longer unreadable, no longer calm. It was disappointment, as if she had expected this, as if she had seen it happen too many times before. Daniels, blinded by his own authority, didn't register the shift. He tightened his grip. "Turn around," he repeated, voice like gravel. "Now." And then, he did something he could never take back. He raised his free hand and struck her. A sharp, open-handed slap across her face. The sound cut through the park like a gunshot. Everything stopped. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Officer Reed's eyes widened in horror. The jogger who had looked away earlier? He had his phone out now, recording. The mother with the child? She gasped audibly. Someone cursed under their breath. Daniels felt the power of the moment, the way the world seemed to tip in his favor. He had put her in her place. He had won. Or so he thought. Because the very next second, the woman slowly turned her head back toward him, eyes locked onto his. And then, she smiled. Not a smile of amusement, not a smile of submission. It was the kind of smile that made Daniel's stomach twist, the kind of smile that told him he had just made the worst mistake of his life. For a moment, the world stood still. Officer Daniels's hand lingered in the air, the sting of the slap still fresh on the woman's face. The sound of it had already faded, but the weight of what he had just done hung heavy in the silence. She didn't touch her cheek. She didn't recoil. Instead, she smiled. Not a smirk, not a look of amusement, but something deeper. A knowing smile, a quiet storm brewing behind her eyes. Daniels felt it then, a shift in the air. Something was wrong, but it was too late. A murmur rippled through the onlookers who had gathered, some whispering in shock, others raising their phones, capturing every second. A jogger stood frozen, mid-step, eyes wide in disbelief. The mother from earlier clutched her child's hand, pulling them closer. Even the wind seemed to stop. And then, a low voice cut through the stillness. "You just made a very big mistake." It wasn't her who said it. It was Officer Reed. Daniels turned, confused. He had expected his rookie partner to stand back like always, to follow orders, to let him do his job. But Reed wasn't backing down. His hands clenched at his sides, his face pale. He knew. Daniels frowned, frustration simmering beneath his skin. "What the hell are you talking about?" Reed swallowed hard. That's Chief Williams." Daniels blinked. The name sounded familiar, but his brain refused to connect the dots. It wasn't possible. The woman took a step closer. Not a big step, not aggressive, just enough to make Daniel's pulse tick faster. Her voice, calm and composed, finally broke the silence. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out." Daniel's stomach dropped. No. This couldn't. His breath hitched. The woman standing in front of him, the one he had humiliated, grabbed, and struck in public, wasn't just some random civilian. She was his new boss, Chief Lillian Williams. Daniel's mind spiraled, grasping for control. This had to be a mistake, a setup, anything but reality. But reality was already crashing down on him. The whispers around them grew louder. Someone in the crowd said her name out loud, and more voices joined in, murmuring in shock. Chief Williams. Daniels felt his knees go weak. His mouth opened, but no words came out. She studied him, her expression still calm. Too calm. "This is a moment you'll never forget, officer," she said quietly. Daniel's breath came in short bursts now. He felt like he was suffocating. A man in the crowd, an older gentleman, chuckled bitterly. "Oh, buddy, you're done." Someone else muttered, "This is going viral." A wave of cold panic rushed through Daniel's chest. He turned sharply to Reed, grasping for an escape. "Reed," he hissed, "tell them she's lying. Tell them this is a misunderstanding." But Reed stepped back. For the first time since Daniels had known him, he stepped back. "I'm not saving you from this." Reed's voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. Daniels felt the walls closing in. His hands started to shake. And then, Chief Williams reached into her jacket. For a split second, Daniels flinched, expecting, he didn't know what. But she didn't pull out a weapon. She pulled out her badge, and she held it up for everyone to see. The golden emblem of authority gleamed under the morning sun. The insignia of his department, of the very force he had served on for years. Stamped on it, clear as day. Chief of Police, Lillian Williams. The final nail in his coffin. The crowd erupted. Gasps, laughter, murmurs of disbelief. Everyone had seen what he had done, and now they knew exactly who he had done it to. Daniel's entire body went cold. Williams took a slow step toward him, lowering her badge, but never breaking eye contact. "You thought I was nobody," she said, voice steady. "You thought I wasn't worth respect." Daniels opened his mouth, desperate to salvage something. "See, Chief Williams, She held up a hand. Silence. "You put your hands on a woman in public," she continued, each word precise, measured. "Abused your authority, lied about an investigation, and you did all of it without even knowing who I was." Daniel's breath was ragged now. He wanted to wake up, to undo everything. But Chief Williams wasn't done. Her next words sealed his fate. "You're suspended." The words slammed into him like a freight train. The crowd cheered. Officer Reed let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Daniels staggered, his entire world crumbling in real time. Williams took one final step forward, so close now that only he could hear her next words. "I hope you enjoyed the power you thought you had." Daniels couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. And just like that, Williams turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the wreckage of his own making. Daniel's world was unraveling, thread by thread, in front of a growing audience. His breath came in short, uneven bursts, his mind scrambling for an escape that didn't exist. He had lost control. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him, suffocating, relentless. He had struck his own chief. And now, standing before her, he wasn't the one holding authority anymore. She was. Chief Williams stood still, her badge gleaming in the sunlight, a symbol of everything he had just defied. The crowd had gone from shocked murmurs to open whispers, phones recording, eyes burning into him. But it was her gaze that terrified him the most, unshaken, unforgiving, unmoved. Daniel's mouth was dry. "Chief, I didn't know. If I had known." Williams raised an eyebrow, a sharp contrast to the raging panic in his voice. "If you had known?" she repeated, her tone deceptively quiet. "That's what you're going with?" His throat tightened. "Chief, please," he stammered. It's a misunderstanding. I thought you were—" She took a step forward, and Daniels flinched. The reaction was instinctive, but it was all she needed to see. "You thought I was nobody." It wasn't a question. Daniels' lips parted, but no words came. Williams exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "How many times have you done this, Officer Daniels?" He froze. "How many times," she continued, "have you used your badge to intimidate someone? How many people have you harassed? How many times have you gotten away with it simply because no one could fight back?" Daniel's mind reeled. His hands twitched at his sides. He wanted to run. The crowd was fully engaged now, hanging on to every word. Some people scoffed, others muttered words like disgusting, unbelievable, about time. Williams didn't need to raise her voice. She had already won. "Here's what's going to happen," she said. "You're done. Your badge, your gun, you'll surrender them by the end of the day." Daniel's chest heaved. He was sinking, fast, and there was nothing to grab onto. "Chief, please," he begged, voice breaking. "I have a family. I've been on the force for years." Williams didn't blink. "And how many lives have you ruined in those years, Daniels?" Silence. His face drained of color. She let the question linger, let it hang in the air like a storm cloud that had finally burst. Then, her voice cut through it all, sharp and final. "You're fired." The words hit him like a bullet. The crowd erupted. Cheers, laughter, vindication. A woman clapped. Someone whistled. The jogger who had been recording let out a triumphant, "Hell yeah." Daniels staggered back. His career, his reputation, all of it was gone. Reed exhaled a breath of relief, watching it all unfold with a mixture of disbelief and silent satisfaction. For the first time since he had joined the force, justice had actually won. Williams gave Daniels one last look, the kind that burned, the kind he would never forget. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. She didn't gloat, didn't look back. She didn't need to. Because Daniels wasn't just defeated, he was erased. Daniels stood frozen, his mind struggling to catch up with reality. His ears rang, drowning out the sounds of the crowd around him, the laughter, the murmurs, the satisfaction. His hands twitched at his sides, his body instinctively reaching for his badge, his gun, his power. But they meant nothing now. He had lost everything. Officer Reed watched, his face unreadable. He had spent years under Daniels' command, forced to look the other way, to stay silent. But now, for the first time, Daniels was the one left powerless. Williams walked away without hesitation, without looking back, because she didn't need to. The crowd began to disperse, but the damage was already done. Daniels could feel it in the way they looked at him, the way they whispered his name like a cautionary tale. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't have to check to know. It was already online. The video of him striking his own police chief. The moment he lost his career in the span of a single slap. A familiar voice cut through the haze. "Hand it over." Daniels turned. Reed stood in front of him now, expression firm. His hand was outstretched, waiting. Daniels hesitated, but then he saw the other officers watching from a distance, waiting. They weren't on his side anymore. His fingers felt numb as he unhooked his badge. The metal felt heavier than it ever had before. He placed it into Reed's palm, followed by his gun. And just like that, he was no longer a cop. Reed studied the items in his hands for a moment, then looked up. "You should go." Daniels swallowed hard. He had never felt this small before. He turned, walking toward his car with slow, mechanical steps. Each one felt like a march toward his own downfall. The moment he shut the door, his reflection stared back at him from the rearview mirror. For the first time in his life, he saw himself for what he really was, and he hated it. The car door slammed shut, but Daniels didn't start the engine. He just sat there, staring blankly at the steering wheel. The weight of it all settled in. The silence, the finality, the emptiness. There was no badge to hide behind now, no authority to abuse, no one to intimidate, just a man, stripped of everything he thought made him powerful. Across the park, Chief Williams continued walking, unbothered, unshaken. Another day, another lesson learned. She didn't need revenge. Justice had already done the work for her. People were still talking, still shaking their heads in disbelief. But more than anything, there was satisfaction in the air. The kind that came when the right person finally faced the consequences they had been dodging for years. Officer Reed watched Daniels' car pull away, exhaling slowly. It was over. For the first time, it was really over. Williams reached the edge of the park, pulled out her phone, and smirked as the notifications flooded in. The video was spreading like wildfire. The city was watching. The world was watching. She tucked the phone away and kept walking. There was still work to be done. What do you think? Was justice served? Have you ever witnessed a moment where power was finally put in its place? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, real, raw, and satisfying, hit that subscribe button and share this video. Because some stories deserve to be told.